The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which took place on February 14, 1929, remains one of the most notorious events in American crime history. This brutal killing of 7 members of George "Bugs" Moran's North Side gang, allegedly orchestrated by rival gangster Al Capone, marked the climax of a violent power struggle for control of Chicago's lucrative criminal enterprises during the Prohibition era. This massacre not only served as a turning point in Chicago's gang wars, but also became a symbol of the unchecked brutality and corruption that characterized organized crime during this period. Despite widespread speculation, no one was ever formally convicted for the massacre, leaving many aspects of the case shrouded in uncertainty. Prohibition and the rise of Gangland Chicago. The roots of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre lie in the broader context of Prohibition, which began in 1920 with the passage of the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act. These laws banned the manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcohol in the United States, giving rise to a massive black market for liquor. Organized crime syndicates, particularly in major cities like Chicago, quickly moved to fill the void left by legal alcohol, making fortunes from bootlegging, speakeasies, and smuggling operations. Chicago became one of the most important hubs for illegal alcohol distribution during Prohibition. 2 major gangs, Al Capone's South Side Gang and Bugs Moran's North Side Gang, vied for control over the city's bootlegging operations. Al Capone, originally from Brooklyn, rose through the ranks of organized crime to become one of the most powerful and feared gangsters in the country. By the late 1920s, Capone controlled much of Chicago's South Side, using a combination of violence, bribery, and intimidation to dominate the illegal liquor trade. On the other side of the city, George "Bugs" Moran led the North Side Gang. Moran, of Irish descent, had taken over leadership after the assassination of his predecessor, Dean O'Banion, in 1924, a murder widely believed to have been ordered by Capone. The rivalry between the South Side and North Side gangs was fierce, characterized by a series of tit-for-tat assassinations, hijackings, and turf wars. Moran's gang frequently targeted Capone's shipments of illegal alcohol, leading to significant financial losses for Capone and heightening tensions between the 2 factions. The stakes were high, and by the late 1920s, the conflict between Capone and Moran had escalated into open warfare. Moran's hijackings of Capone's liquor shipments, combined with failed assassination attempts on both sides, set the stage for what would become one of the bloodiest episodes in organized crime history. The setup, luring Moran's men to their deaths. In early 1929, Capone's trusted associate, Jack "Machine Gun" McGurn, devised a plan to eliminate Moran and his key men in one decisive move. The plan was to lure Moran's top enforcers to a garage at 2122 North Clark Street, which the North Side Gang used as a headquarters for their bootlegging operations. To accomplish this, McGurn arranged for Moran's men to believe that a large shipment of stolen Canadian whiskey was available for purchase. The bait was irresistible, and Moran arranged for several of his top lieutenants to meet at the garage on the morning of February 14, 1929. McGurn's plan was meticulously executed. A lookout was stationed outside the garage to alert McGurn's men when Moran arrived. However, a crucial mistake was made. At around 10:30 a.m., the lookout spotted a man who resembled Moran entering the garage. In reality, the man was Albert Weinshank, a close associate of Moran, who happened to be dressed similarly. Mistaking Weinshank for Moran, the lookout signaled to McGurn's hitmen that the time to strike had arrived. The massacre, a ruthless execution. 4 men approached the garage, 2 of them dressed in police uniforms, while the other 2 wore civilian clothes. The men in police uniforms entered the garage, giving the impression that a raid was underway. The 7 men inside the garage, members and associates of the North Side Gang, complied, believing they were being arrested as part of a routine police raid. The officers ordered them to line up against a wall, and the gang members followed instructions without resistance. What happened next was brutal and swift. The 2 men in civilian clothes drew Thompson's submachine guns and opened fire on the helpless victims, spraying them with bullets in a matter of seconds. The attackers fired more than 70 rounds, ensuring that none of the men survived the assault. The sheer firepower used in the massacre was meant to send a message, not only to Moran but to all of Capone's rivals, that opposition to Capone's empire would be met with ruthless violence. Of the 7 men in the garage, all but 1 died instantly, Frank Gusenberg, one of the Moran gang's enforcers, survived the initial attack despite being shot 14 times. When police arrived at the scene, Gusenberg was still conscious but refused to identify his attackers, adhering to the gangster code of silence. He died a few hours later in the hospital without giving any further information. The other victims included Peter Gusenberg, Albert Kachelek, Adam Heyer, John May, Reinhard Schwimmer, and Albert Weinshank, whose resemblance to Moran had set the plan in motion. Despite the mass killing, Moran himself narrowly escaped the massacre by arriving late to the meeting. Upon seeing the police cars outside the garage, he stayed away, unwittingly saving his life. The aftermath, a turning point in Chicago's underworld. The St. Valentine's Day massacre sent shockwaves through Chicago and the nation. The sheer brutality of the attack, carried out in broad daylight, underscored the lawlessness and violence that had come to define the Prohibition era. Public outrage over the massacre was immediate, and the press dubbed it one of the most violent episodes in organized crime history. In the immediate aftermath, Moran's power in Chicago's underworld was severely weakened. The loss of so many key members of his gang left him vulnerable, and his criminal empire never fully recovered. Moran himself publicly blamed Capone for the massacre, stating, "Only Capone kills like that." However, Capone had carefully constructed an alibi. He had traveled to Florida days before the massacre and ensured that he was seen by multiple witnesses at the time of the killings. As a result, he was never charged or arrested for the crime. McGurn, who had planned the massacre, also avoided prosecution. Despite being the chief architect of the attack, McGurn was able to establish an alibi, claiming he had spent the morning of February 14th with his girlfriend. Although authorities strongly suspected his involvement, they were unable to gather enough concrete evidence to bring him to trial. The case officially remains unsolved to this day. The fallout, the beginning of the end for Al Capone. While the St. Valentine's Day massacre helped Capone solidify his control over Chicago's criminal underworld, it also marked the beginning of his downfall. The public outrage generated by the massacre, combined with increasing pressure from law enforcement, turned Capone into a national symbol of unchecked criminality and violence. The federal government, which had long been criticized for failing to rein in organized crime, faced mounting calls for action. The massacre brought renewed attention to the corrupt relationship between city officials and the criminal underworld. Chicago's law enforcement agencies were rife with bribery and collusion, which allowed gangsters like Capone to operate with near impunity. However, the sheer scale of the St. Valentine's Day massacre made it impossible to ignore. The federal government, led by Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, launched an intensified investigation into Capone's finances, seeking to bring him to justice through his illegal income rather than his violent activities. Capone's eventual downfall came not from the massacre or his violent crimes, but from tax evasion. In 1931, following a meticulous investigation led by Treasury agent Frank J. Wilson, Capone was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in prison. His imprisonment marked the end of his reign over Chicago's criminal empire, and by the time he was released from Alcatraz in 1939, his health had deteriorated and his power had faded. The legacy of the St. Valentine's Day massacre. The St. Valentine's Day massacre remains one of the most infamous events in American organized crime history, symbolizing the violent lengths to which Prohibition-era gangsters would go to maintain their control over the illegal liquor trade. The massacre not only exposed the ruthlessness of Chicago's gangland underworld, but also played a key role in shaping public perceptions of organized crime. The massacre also had a lasting impact on law enforcement. The public outcry following the killings prompted federal authorities to take a more active role in pursuing organized crime figures, leading to the eventual repeal of Prohibition in 1933. The massacre is a critical turning point in how organized crime was viewed and addressed by both the public and the government. Before the massacre, gang violence was often seen as a local issue, handled by corrupt or overwhelmed city officials. Afterward, it became clear that gangsters like Capone posed a national threat that required federal intervention. The massacre was instrumental in changing public attitudes toward Prohibition, as many began to question whether the ban on alcohol was worth the bloodshed it incited. The massacre's brutal nature also catalyzed the government's efforts to enact stronger federal laws aimed at dismantling organized crime. One of the key legislative responses was the development of more sophisticated forensic methods and the creation of federal crime-fighting agencies, such as the FBI. The need to investigate and prosecute organized crime more effectively led to innovations in forensic science, including the use of ballistics to match bullets and weapons used in the massacre. The cultural legacy of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre has cemented its place in popular culture, symbolizing the height of mob violence during the Prohibition era. The event has been immortalized in countless books, films, and television shows, often used as a dramatic example of the lawlessness and brutality that defined Chicago during the 1920s. In popular memory, the massacre is inseparably linked with the persona of Al Capone, even though he was never officially charged with the crime. Hollywood has revisited the massacre time and again, dramatizing the rivalry between Capone and Moran and depicting the event as a turning point in the gangster genre. One of the most famous depictions of the massacre is in the 1967 film The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which dramatizes the lead-up to the event and the killings themselves. The massacre has also been referenced in numerous gangster films, from Scarface to The Untouchables, further solidifying its cultural significance. Artifacts from the massacre, including the infamous bullet-riddled bricks from the garage wall, have become prized memorabilia. These bricks, once located at 2122 North Clark Street, were removed before the garage was demolished in 1967. Some were displayed at various crime-themed exhibits and museums, such as the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, where visitors can see evidence from the massacre, learn about the rise of organized crime, and explore the Prohibition era's impact on American society. The crime scene and its modern-day legacy. The garage where the St. Valentine's Day Massacre took place has long since been demolished, but the location, 2122 North Clark Street, remains a somber point of historical reflection. After the demolition of the garage in 1967, the site was transformed into a parking lot, and today there is no physical structure left to mark the location of one of the most violent crimes in American history. However, the memory of the massacre lingers, with visitors and true crime enthusiasts making pilgrimages to the site. The legacy of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre extends beyond the physical location. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, the corrosive influence of corruption, and the social upheaval that Prohibition-style policies can ignite. The massacre, while horrific, illuminated the extent of the criminal underworld's reach and highlighted the urgency for legal and societal reforms. In many ways, the massacre's legacy can be felt in today's law enforcement practices, particularly in the development of organized crime task forces and efforts to reduce violent crime in urban areas. It was a pivotal moment that marked the beginning of a more coordinated federal effort to tackle organized crime and ultimately contributed to the dismantling of many mob empires across the country. A lasting impact on organized crime. The massacre's effect on organized crime extended far beyond Chicago. As news of the killings spread, it became clear that the tactics employed by mobsters like Capone were far more ruthless and far-reaching than previously understood. The event helped shift public opinion against the glamorization of gangsters, which had often been romanticized in the media up until that point. Instead, it highlighted the human cost of organized crime, with ordinary people frequently caught in the crossfire of gang warfare. Moreover, the massacre underscored the weaknesses in law enforcement's ability to control organized crime, particularly in cities where local police departments were rife with corruption. The inability to bring Capone or his associates to justice for the massacre exposed the limits of local police efforts and demonstrated the necessity of federal involvement. This realization ultimately contributed to the growing power and influence of federal agencies like the FBI, which began to play a more significant role in combating organized crime in the years that followed. The end of an era. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was not just a pivotal moment in the history of Chicago's underworld. It marked the beginning of the end for the era of Prohibition-era gangster dominance. While Al Capone continued to wield influence for a few more years, the massacre intensified public and governmental pressure to crack down on organized crime. By the early 1930s, Prohibition was coming to an end, and many of the criminal empires built on bootlegging began to crumble. The legacy of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre is multifaceted. On one level, it remains an infamous crime that exemplifies the violent excesses of the Prohibition era. On another, it serves as a historical turning point that catalyzed legal and societal changes in how organized crime was addressed in America. For historians, true crime enthusiasts, and those interested in the history of law enforcement, the massacre remains a symbol of a dark chapter in American history, one that revealed both the brutality of criminal enterprises and the challenges of enforcing the law in an era defined by corruption and violence. Thank you for spending time with us through Spookscope today. Feel free to share your wisdom and knowledge in the comment section, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share it with your friends and family. Until next time, my dear spooker, stay curious.